My seat was next to a fire exit, behind a fake ficus tree, at a table so far from the dance floor that I could only tell the music had changed because people's heads moved differently. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part of the night, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire Hartwell. At the time of my brother's wedding, I was 31 years old, a second-year surgical resident at Johns Hopkins, and the only person in my family who had ever left Tennessee. Not the only one who had tried, just the only one who had actually gone. My brother Daniel was getting married to a woman named Brooke, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh you could hear from 3 rooms away and a talent for making everyone feel immediately at ease. I liked Brooke. I still do. None of what happened that night was her fault. Daniel was my parents' golden child. I say that without bitterness now, though it took me years to get there. He was the one who stayed. He took over my father's hardware store at 22, coached Little League on Saturdays, showed up to every family dinner with a bottle of wine and a story that made everyone at the table lean in. He was warm and easy and present in all the ways I was not. While I was pulling 40-hour call shifts and missing Christmases and apologizing over voicemail, he was there in the physical, irreplaceable way that actually matters to people who measure love in proximity. I understood it, intellectually. I just hadn't quite made peace with it yet. The wedding was held at a restored barn venue outside of Knoxville, the kind of place with Edison bulbs strung across oak beams and mason jars full of wildflowers on every table. It was genuinely beautiful. I drove down from Baltimore alone, which was its own quiet kind of statement, though no one acknowledged it as such. My mother had called 2 weeks before to confirm I was coming, and I remember thinking it was strange that she'd asked it that way, confirm, like my attendance was a variable that needed to be logged rather than assumed. I arrived the afternoon before the ceremony, as requested, ready to help however I was needed. My mother handed me a list of errands and said, "We thought you'd be more comfortable handling logistics, since you don't really know most of the guests." She said it gently. She always did. But I stood in the driveway for a moment after she walked back inside, rolling her words around, trying to figure out why they landed the way they did. Since you don't really know most of the guests, my family had lived in this county for 3 generations. The guests were neighbors, church members, people who had watched me grow up. I knew them. I had simply stopped being the version of myself they recognized. I ran the errands. I picked up the extra centerpieces from the florist, returned 2 of them because the colors were wrong, drove 20 minutes out of my way to get the specific brand of sparkling water that Brooke's mother preferred. I did it without complaint, because that is what I do. I solve problems quietly. I always have. The morning of the wedding, there was a moment brief, easy to miss that I think about more than I probably should. I came downstairs in my dress, the nicest thing I owned at the time, a deep navy wrap dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion. My mother looked up from the kitchen table and said, "Oh, that's pretty." Then she looked past me at my father and said, "Frank, did you call the caterer back about the vegetarian plates?" That was it. That was the whole exchange. Daniel, when he came down 20 minutes later in his rented tuxedo, got a standing ovation from both parents, a photograph that I suspect still hangs in the living room, and my mother actually crying. The good kind of crying. The kind that means you have exceeded every hope I ever had for you. I told myself it was just wedding day nerves. I was good at telling myself things. The seating arrangement was discovered about 40 minutes before the ceremony started. I found my name card at a table near the back corner, not at the family table, not in the second row of reserved seats, but at what I would later hear someone refer to as the overflow table. The people seated with me were a college friend of Brooke's who had driven in from out of state and didn't know anyone, 2 co-workers of Daniel's who had apparently only been invited as a formality, and an older couple who turned out to have been invited by mistake. Their invitation was meant for a different family with the same last name who had since moved away. My cousin Jennifer found me standing at the table reading my name card and said, with genuine confusion, "How did you end up back here?" I told her I didn't know. She said, "I'll go ask Aunt Patty." She never came back. I sat down. I straightened the silverware that didn't need straightening. I told myself it was a mistake, a simple oversight in the chaos of wedding planning, and that someone would come correct it before the ceremony began. No one came. The lights dimmed. The string quartet started. I watched the back of 3 strangers' heads and a decorative ficus that needed watering, and I thought, very clearly, I drove 9 hours for this. What I did not think, not even for a moment, was that the night was about to change completely. I didn't know that a man named Dr. Raymond Ochoa was seated 4 tables away. I didn't know he had seen me come in. I didn't know he had been trying to figure out, for the past 30 minutes, where he recognized me from. Dr. Ochoa was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He was 63 years old, with a reputation that existed on the kind of scale that made medical students go quiet when his name came up. He had trained surgeons who now ran departments at Mayo and Mass General. He had testified before the Senate on healthcare policy. He had, on 2 separate occasions, been offered positions at institutions that are considered the pinnacle of academic medicine, and had turned them down both times because he said Tennessee still had work to be done. He was also, as I would later learn, the father of Brooke's college roommate. That was why he was there. A quiet, secondary connection to the wedding, not family, not a named guest in the program, just someone who had come as a courtesy and been seated wherever there was room, which, apparently, was 4 tables from the fire exit. I found this out later. At the time, I only noticed him because of the way he carried himself when he crossed the room during cocktail hour, the specific, unhurried posture of someone who has been the most qualified person in every room for so long that they have stopped needing to announce it. I was standing near the bar, holding a glass of club soda, trying to look like someone who had chosen to stand alone, rather than someone who had been placed alone. I had just finished a conversation with one of Daniel's co-workers that consisted almost entirely of the other person explaining to me how hospital billing worked, a topic I engage with professionally on a near-daily basis, but I smiled and nodded because the alternative was explaining why I didn't need to, and that felt worse. That was when I heard it. "Excuse me." A measured voice, close but not startling. I turned. Dr. Ochoa was looking at me with the careful focus of someone trying to place a memory. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Raymond Ochoa. I'm trying to figure out if I know you." "Claire Hartwell," I said. He repeated it quietly. "The way you repeat something when it's clicking into place." "Hartwell. Are you in medicine?" I told him I was a surgical resident at Hopkins. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man. But something behind his eyes changed. A quiet recalibration. "What year?" "Second. Cardiothoracic track." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you present at the Thoracic Symposium in Philadelphia last February? A case study on intraoperative decision-making in pediatric valve repair?" I had. I had presented to a room of about 200 people, nervous in a way I rarely admitted to being, and I had received a response that my program director described afterward as unusually strong. I had told exactly 2 people from my personal life about it. Neither of them was at this wedding. "That was me," I said. He studied me for another second. Then he said, "Dr. Hartwell, I spent 3 days after that presentation thinking about your methodology. I made my fellows read the abstract. I was hoping you'd be at this year's conference." He extended his hand again, differently this time, the way physicians shake hands with other physicians rather than with strangers. "How do you know the couple?" "Daniel is my brother," I said. Something moved across his face that I didn't fully understand at the time. I understand it now. It was the specific expression of a person who has just mentally rearranged a room. He asked if I was seated with my family. I told him I was near the back. He looked in the direction I gestured and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I've been seated alone at a table of people I've never met, and I suspect the next 4 hours will go considerably better for both of us if we help each other out. Would you be willing to sit with me?" It was graciously phrased. He was giving me an exit from my corner of the room without requiring me to name why I needed one. I recognized the maneuver because I had used versions of it myself on difficult patients, offering someone a choice that preserved their dignity while moving them somewhere better. "I'd like that," I said. "We relocated. I don't think anyone noticed us do it." The room was in that loose, pre-ceremony shuffle where no one is fully paying attention to anything except their own conversation. We found 2 seats at a table that turned out to be shared with a retired federal judge, a woman who ran a regional hospital network in East Tennessee, and 2 of Brooke's aunts who were working their way steadily through the wine and paying attention to no one. The conversation that followed was one of the most substantive I'd had outside of a hospital in probably 2 years. "Doctor," Ochoa asked genuine, searching questions about my research interests, about the cases I found most difficult, about where I saw the field moving in the next decade. The judge, who had apparently spent 20 years handling medical malpractice cases before his appointment, asked sharp follow-up questions of his own. The hospital network director leaned in about halfway through and started taking notes on her phone. I was not performing. I was just talking, but I noticed, in a dim and distant way, that the version of me sitting at that table was a different version than the one who had been standing behind the ficus tree an hour before. During the reception dinner, my mother came over twice. The first time, I could see her trying to parse the company I was keeping. The slight hesitation before she smiled, the way her eyes moved from face to face trying to identify the variables. She was gracious, the way my mother always was in public, and she stayed for about 4 minutes before excusing herself. The second time, she brought my father. My father was a man who expressed love primarily through acts of service, and who had not once, in my memory, told me directly that he was proud of me. I knew he was. In the way you know things that have never been said through inference, through the way he occasionally mentioned me to others when he didn't think I could hear. But knowing a thing and hearing it are not the same, and I had spent most of my life in the gap between them. He shook Dr. Ochoa's hand. They exchanged the usual pleasantries. At some point, I heard my father say, "Claire's always been the driven one," and I had to look down at my plate for a moment. The driven one. It was the closest he had come, in public, to acknowledging what my life actually looked like. I turned it over in my mind like a stone, trying to decide what it weighed. The moment I will remember for the rest of my life came after dinner. Dr. Ochoa had been asked by Brooke's father, I believe, who had recognized him at some point during the evening, to say a few words. He declined a microphone. He simply stood, and the room quieted in the way rooms do when someone with genuine authority chooses to speak. He thanked the families. He said kind and specific things about Brooke and Daniel, the details of which I've mostly forgotten. And then he paused, in the way that skilled speakers pause when they are about to change direction. He said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone I had the fortune of meeting this evening. Earlier this year, I sat in a conference room in Philadelphia and watched a young surgeon present a case study that changed how I think about a problem I've been working on for 15 years. That surgeon is here tonight, and I suspect most of the people in this room don't know what she does." I understood before he said my name that he was going to say it. My hands were very still in my lap. He said, "Dr. Claire Hartwell is a second-year resident at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She is also Daniel's sister, which means this family has raised someone who is, and I do not use this word casually, exceptional." He looked at me directly. "Dr. Hartwell, it was an honor to sit with you this evening." The room applauded. It was the ordinary, polite applause of a reception that has just received an unexpected toast, but it moved through the room completely. No table was silent. I looked at my father. He was not smiling, not in the way that means displeasure. I want to be precise about this. He was not frowning. He was not angry. He had the particular expression of a man who has just seen something that requires him to revise a long-held understanding, and the revision is happening in real time, and it is costing him something. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. My mother had her hand over her mouth. Daniel, at the head table, was looking at me with an expression I had also never seen, something between pride and the specific discomfort of realizing you have undercounted someone for a long time. I did not cry. I was not going to cry, but I breathed in very carefully through my nose and looked down at the table for a moment, and when I looked back up I made sure my face was composed. Afterward, several people came to find me. Daniel's co-workers, who had spent dinner talking to me mostly out of obligation. 2 of the bridesmaids. The hospital network director, who handed me her card and asked if I would be willing to consult on a program she was developing. My Aunt Sandra, who grabbed my arm and said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" As if the problem had been my silence rather than the room's hearing. Dr. Ochoa shook my hand before he left. He said, "I meant every word," and I believed him. Because men like that don't offer words they don't mean they have too little patience for the waste. My father found me near the end of the night. The band was playing something slow, the kind of song that signals the last hour of a wedding, and most of the older guests had moved to the edges of the room where it was easier to talk. He came and stood beside me, and we both looked out at the dance floor for a moment without speaking. He said, "I didn't know you'd given a talk that people were still talking about." I said, I didn't know you'd want to. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the conversation might simply end the way so many of ours did at the edge of something real, then retreating to safer ground. But he said, I want to. 3 words. Not an apology, not an accounting of the years, not the speech I had written and rewritten in my head since I was about 17. Just, I want to. I understood that it was the beginning of something rather than a resolution. That the gap between us wasn't going to close in one conversation at the tail end of a wedding reception, that some debts of presence and attention are too accumulated to be settled in an evening. I knew all of that. But I also knew that something had shifted. Slowly, imperfectly, the way things shift in real life rather than in stories. Daniel found me later, when I was getting my coat from the rack near the entrance. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he pulled me into a hug, the real kind. Not the surface-level shoulder touch we'd defaulted to for years. I'm sorry about the seating, he said into my shoulder. It worked out, I said, because it had. I drove home the next morning, 9 hours north, back to the hospital, and the residence lounge, and the overnight shifts, and the work that is still, even on the hardest days, the clearest sense I have of who I am. I had 3 missed calls from my mother, which was 3 more than usual. I called her back somewhere in Virginia, and she talked for 45 minutes about the wedding, about Brooke, about Dr. Ochoa, about things she was proud of that she hadn't said before. I drove and listened and said very little, which felt, for once, like the right amount. There is a photograph from that night that Brooke sent me a few weeks later. I'm sitting at the table with Dr. Ochoa and the judge and the hospital director, mid-conversation, not aware the picture is being taken. I look like someone who belongs exactly where they are. I keep it at my desk, not because I need reminding, but because there are long nights in the hospital when it helps to see yourself through a lens that isn't exhausted. Everyone finds their table eventually. Sometimes you have to get lost near the ficus tree first.